Good morning, greetings. Good afternoon for those in Asia. Welcome to our webinar on how to prepare your organisation for COP28. We are part of H Advisors, and for people who don't know us because of our rebrand last year, we are the Global Strategic Communications Advisory Network. We're based in 47 offices in 25 countries. We are global experts who have that local knowledge. We have a sustain network which works in all areas of ESG and sustainability communications and advisory, and we cover across all our markets. Today we are bringing you a webinar on COP28, and we have with us two very special guests. We have Miguel Veiga-Pestana, who is the former head of communications and marketing for COP28, and Laura Stockwell, who's based in Dubai and is managing director of our H Advisors office in the Middle East. There will be a chance to ask questions throughout this webinar, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So please do that by typing in your question in the question field provided on this webinar. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Laura, who's going to talk through a few points on COP28, where it is and the different aspects of the logistics involved. Laura.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, absolutely. So I'm here based in Dubai, where obviously COP28 is going to be held in late November, early December. And we're going to take you through some of the details around where COP is and what are the different elements of the site. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Jess. So many of you may know the United Arab Emirates, but just in case, I thought it would be helpful to set the context. So we obviously, the event will be starting on the 30th of November through to the 12th of December. Now, COP28 is being hosted by the United Arab Emirates, and that means run really by the Abu Dhabi government, but it will be held at the Expo site, which is actually in Dubai. So if you look at the map here, you can see that it makes more sense to base yourself in Dubai, and you can fly into Abu Dhabi and base yourself there, but you're going to be doing a long journey every day, probably an hour from Abu Dhabi, whereas you'd be about 40 minutes from the city of Dubai, a little longer if you take the public metro. Next slide, please. So here we have a map of the Expo site with the COP28 sort of plan of the green zone and the blue zone. Now, one of the criticisms of previous COPs is that it's been quite difficult to interact between the green zone and the blue zone. So you can see here that they've designed it so that there's easy flow between the two. Now, most of you will know that the blue zone is obviously for accredited only, UNFCCC accredited members and delegates and country pavilions. So it isn't accessible to the private sector unless you have that accreditation and unless you are a sponsor of COP28. Now, the sponsorship for COP28 did close last week, but I understand that there will still be opportunities for those if they still want to get involved. So you can see here, you've got the blue zone and the green zone, and you can see the three hubs: technology and innovation, decarbonisation, and knowledge. So those are the key three hubs for the private sector to be aware of. Next slide, please. So here you have a little more drilling down into the green zone. So the green zone, obviously where the private sector will specifically engage. It's also open to civil society and NGOs and youth groups and the public. So what will make sense is that you focus on which of the hubs make most sense to your business, and maybe you might choose a couple of those hubs to host an event. But what would make sense is that you align your event with both a hub and one of the key theme days, which we'll show in a slide shortly. So companies that aren't signed up to sponsorship still have the opportunity to engage and book spaces within the green zone. And there'll be all sorts of spaces, you know, meeting rooms, networking areas, exhibition areas, restaurants for business breakfasts. And ultimately, what you have to do is decide what sort of an event you're going to have. And I believe that there are spaces in the green zone that are up to about 350 people. So you can do something small or something big. And you have to sign up, you know, think about what you want to achieve and then how many people you're going to attract and what sort of space you're looking for. And then submit a request to COP28 aligning with their priority barrier to entry requirements as well. So that's either aligning yourself to the race to zero themes, or showing your own alignment to decarbonisation, showing your sustainability strategy, showing your net zero targets. And the green zone will be ticketed, but it will be a minimal cost. So if you, for example, take a space within the green zone, you will be able to probably get, you know, depending on the sort of scale of your event, you'll have a certain number of complimentary tickets. But if you were just to decide you wanted to pop into green zone and you know, visit, then you would need to log in to the website it's not accessible yet, but there will be a minimal charge, something like £10. And that's mainly just to understand the volume of numbers coming. And that will probably be used as a sort of carbon offset as well for the event. So you will need to book your tickets. A key date for your diaries, if you want to submit a request to be a speaker or host an event in the green zone, then your deadline is the 28th of July. So a little over 5 weeks to make a decision on that. Next slide, please. So many of you will have seen this draft program already outlining the thematic days. We're expecting an update on this by the end of the month. We're not sure how granular that detail will be, but obviously they put this program out for consultation. So I imagine the themes will be the same, but the order in which they come might be rejigged. What will be other feedback from the Sharm el-Sheikh COP was that there wasn't or previous COPs, I think generally, is that there wasn't enough alignment between the blue zone and the green zone. So what they've ensured this year is that the theme in the blue zone will be mirrored directly in the green zone. So that will mean that obviously, you know, negotiations and discussions will work together, and it'll mean there'll be a more logical overlap when members of the blue zone go in to visit exhibitions and events in the green zone. They're expecting at least 150 world leaders in that initial opening and World Climate Action Summit. So the green zone itself will be quite light in terms of programming over that first weekend, and security will be extremely tight. So in terms of your planning, just to be aware that that weekend is very specifically for the sort of global leaders. I think more information as well will come out about that at the end of the month. And then next slide, please. And then, yeah, just to sort of summarize, these are your key dates to be aware of. So we're expecting in the next couple of days that the first event partners and experience partners are going to be announced. This was supposed to happen, you know, at least 10 days ago. So there's been a bit of a delay. But I was told by COP on Friday that they're expecting this to come out in the next couple of days. So look out for that. As I mentioned, the deadline for the speaker slots in the green zone is the 28th of July. And then we'll expect to see the final thematic days and program announced at the end of June. And then another round of event partners will be announced at, at some point in September. So that's it from me at the moment. I'll be able to ask some other questions if you need to at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. Now, can I please introduce you to Miguel Veiga-Pestana, who I said before is the former head of comms and marketing at COP28, because we really want to learn a little bit more and get his insights from this. Hi, Miguel.
Hi there. Hi, everyone.
So before we start, we have got a couple of questions, and we have had some questions come through. So please use the question facility on the webinar, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But the first one, Miguel, is why is this COP going to be different?
Well, there's 3 or 4 reasons why I think it will be different. The first is, of course, it will be probably one of the largest COPs. You've already heard a little bit about what's envisaged with the blue zone and the green zone, but that predict between 65 and 7,000 participants. So if you compare that with something like COP26 in Glasgow, which was 35 to 40, and it's double the size. So it will be a significant moment, and we're expecting it to be probably one of the most, the most significant COPs since the Paris Agreement was signed in COP21. So I think it's going to be a major event in that. Secondly, the UAE has taken quite I think, an interesting approach in the way it's set out engaging on COP. So firstly, obviously, they have appointed a president, and you have Dr. Sultan Al Jaber as the president of the COP, but you also have what I call a COP trio. So they have appointed 2 climate advocates, if you like, for the COP, which is both Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak and Her Excellency Sharma, both of whom bring very different experience to bear. In that Razan was obviously ahead of IUCN and is very, very actively engaged in areas around things like biodiversity and food security. And then Sharma, who is a well-known youth activist and who will be putting youth at the heart of the COP process. And I think that's kind of interesting in itself, that they've taken a very different approach to how they construct the COP presidency team. And obviously they also have a consultative forum that they've created. They've got a COP advisory committee that's got, I think, about 30 plus members on that COP committee. But what's most interesting is that the largest majority of representatives on that COP advisory committee are from the global south. So they're making real efforts to bring in the voices of some of the least developed nations and nations outside of the so-called Western economy. So I think that gives a sense of how they're thinking about the approach that they need to take. Thirdly, they've got a significant moment with the global stocktake, which people haven't perhaps focused as much time and effort on yet. But this is really a process that, again, was set up. It's set up under Article 14 of the Paris Agreement. It was part of the agreement that they would look and do a review. In fact, there will be a global stocktake this year with the COP. There'll be a second global stocktake in 2028. And then this is supposed to feed into the NCDs, or the nationally determined contributions of individual member states, and as well as their national adaptation plans. So this will actually shape what happens next in terms of how countries are going to set those targets and their ambitions into 2030 and beyond. But it will really give us a sense of how much we still have to do, where the areas of progress need to still be made. That will happen over the course of the next 2 to 3 months. There'll be major discussions happening in New York in September, and then again in October there'll be a kind of the release of the global stocktake. I don't think anyone's going to be too surprised to hear how far off we are in the delivery of our Paris Agreement commitments, and how much we still have to do, particularly in the area of climate finance, which is one of the big sticking points around the whole of the COP process. Is this big focus at the moment on climate finance and how we're going to fund some of the things that we still have to accelerate the delivery of. And the last thing I'd say is they have a very tough agenda in a way, because they've taken on a lot as a presidency. You've got how, we're going to look at mitigation, obviously the whole issue of how do we stay within the 1.5 degree commitment we've made. That's going to put a big focus on energy and the just energy transition. There's a lot of, obviously that's already generated lots of controversy around the debate on the just energy transition, but it's broader than just energy. There's other aspects of mitigation that are going to be part of the conversations for the COP. We've got to set targets for adaptation. We all know that we're going to have to live in a warmer world, so we're going to have to we're going to have to understand what that requires in terms of some of the critical adaptation areas. Then we've got this loss and damage fund, which was also a commitment that came out of Sharm el-Sheikh. Huge need there to not just to think about, well, what kind of money we're going to be talking about, but actually to set up the means by which to distribute it. So this is quite something. The UN as an institutional body takes a long time to decide how to implement something like this. So they're trying to do it in an accelerated form. And then lastly, if you've got to sort of think about where finance fits within all of this, because a huge amount of the focus inside the COP, but also outside of it, is going to be on how we look at financing all of that. So they've got a very big agenda to manage, probably bigger than most other COP presidencies have had to manage. And I think for the UAE, if I just look at what's happened in Bonn last week, where it's the sort of midpoint of the year where people are thinking about how does the COP agenda begin to map up for the COP sessions in November. What you can see is that was a very tough session, and there wasn't a huge amount of progress made on a number of these key deliverables. So I think the UAE will have its work cut out to try and kind of broker the negotiated deals that need to come out of the COP process. And then very lastly to say it, that they've got some they've been very clear about wanting this to be a bold COP, a COP that's transformational rather than incremental. They want it to be an inclusive COP. So they're setting out, they're saying that this is critical to what they want to deliver. They're very keen on engaging, obviously, with the private sector in that, and that's one of the things why we're here talking together as a group, is the critical role that the private sector is going to play in the run-up to COP and at COP itself. So there's a huge amount to play for. And last remark to add is that unlike previous COPs, there is a sense that this is also part of a reform process for the UN FFC processes themselves and the way that COPs work. And the intent here is to really start to see this COP as a roadmap for future COPs. And now that we're starting to see who the future COP presidents are, though we still have a bit of a dispute between Armenia and Bulgaria for the next one, but then Brazil and then Australia, you can start to think about building a progressive set of outcomes. So you don't have to deliver everything in COP. You can sow the seeds of what will be achievable and deliverable in future COPs.
Brilliant. Thank you, Miguel. Miguel, we've had a question come in and you've kind of touched on it briefly, well, quite a lot in that, but I just want to kind of phrase this to you and you might pick on some points. Someone's asked about what priorities does the UAE have? So I guess what does the UAE want to achieve with this COP?
Well, as I said, at the macro level, I think they've been tasked to deliver things by the UNFCCC and by the parties to the conference. So, but I think if you visit the COP UAE website, you can see that they're making it clear that they're there to drive a transformational agenda, and they want to see bold, ambitious outcomes, not just incremental progress. So they've made that very clear. They are very keen to make it inclusive, so they want to bring as many of the different voices into the process, even the voices that perhaps not everybody agrees should be in the room, but there's a sense that everybody does need to be in the room because we need to find a way through, and we can't make it an exclusive process. But if you look across, there's, as I mentioned, you've got the just energy transition. Within that, they've done, they're looking at various things that as a presidency, they'd like to see as outcomes. So perhaps you would see more progress on renewables and investing in renewables with specific targets around renewables. They've done a huge amount themselves on decarbonizing their energy system. So obviously, how much you could progress that across the board and decarbonize the oil and gas sector. How much you can do around methane, because we had a commitment on methane that came out of COP26 in Glasgow, but hasn't seen much really by way of implementation. And again, the UAE has done a lot on this issue domestically, so it's something that they may well want to revisit as a president. You have hard-to-abate sectors, cement, aluminium, steel. These are all industries which are going to be critical to the future, but at the same time, these are highly energy-intensive, highly carbon-intensive sectors, so there will be a big focus on the hard-to-abate sector. I know they're looking at, obviously, transport and zero transport as being one of the critical areas. So you look at around the sort of area of energy and infrastructure, transport, these are going to be key things. You've then got, first time they put health on the agenda. This is the first real time that the topic of health will be at the heart of the deliberations. So I think we've had this sort of raised in the sidelines of Sharm el-Sheikh, but this is going to be a massive area of attention, which I think is good to see. Biodiversity and nature, and the alignment between the COP15 process and the Biodiversity Convention, and how that intersects with climate, and specifically this interplay between climate targets and biodiversity targets, and the consistency between them is a big focus for the presidency. And within that, food security and water security, these are things which the region knows a lot about. People are obviously, water is a precious commodity, but it's particularly the case in countries like the UAE. So a good understanding of what it is that you can do to address water stress and global food and the access to global food. And then I think that there'll be clearly a focus on finance. Loss and damage fund, which I don't think I mentioned at the outset. Loss and damage was one of the big things that Sharm el-Sheikh did set out to kind of put the onus on the UAE, if you like, to come up with a solution. So we've agreed that we need to have a loss and damage fund. We've agreed that fund is there to address the most vulnerable in society that are going to be the most affected by the impacts of climate change. We've got the Bridgetown initiative. You've got a number of other parties that are talking about, well, what does that look like? But as I said, how you go about making that real, and how you raise the funding and the capital and unlock the funding that you need to deliver it, and then how do you build the sort of implementational roadmap? That's another priority that the UAE will no doubt be putting a lot of time and effort behind.
Great, thank you. Got another question is, how much of a role will the private sector actually play in this COP?
Well, a lot. I think that there's a very strong desire on the part of the presidency to bring more private sector engagement. And obviously, you've heard a bit about the green zone already. You've heard about the fact that there will be more partners this time around than in previous COPs. So there will be more direct private sector partnership and sponsorship of the COP process. Obviously, there is also, by the way, we didn't really mention it, but the 2 first days of 1st December, 2nd, there will actually be a climate action, a World Climate Action Summit that's being held at the Conrad Hotel in Dubai, and that's also where the private sector comes together with civil society and government. So the first 2 days of the COP itself will be directly bringing in the voice of the private sector from the get-go, and I think they've got 5 or 6 big topics that are very consistent with what I've just talked about, that will be thematic areas of dialogue around those 2 days, and that's a big opportunity for private sector players to engage and to participate in that summit, as well as in the green zone and in the blue zone engagements that will be happening in the various pavilions and the various events. And then, of course, that's only inside. There'll be opportunities to do a lot outside of the ring, if you like, of dialogue that will be going on inside the expo site. So I think lots of opportunity, but I think it's also fair to say that there's a heightened desire on the part of the presidency and other stakeholders that businesses that go have to be held more accountable for what they say. So if they're going to be there making pledges or commitments, how do you hold their feet to the fire to make sure these are not hollow words or empty pledges that nobody actually then sees materialize. So there's a lot of attention being paid to how you can build more accountability mechanisms so that private sector partners that engage with governments or other sort of stakeholders in delivering some of these big pledges, that there are ways of tracking progress, and that you have an opportunity to kind of hold people's feet in the fire on when that's required. And so I think businesses should be very cognizant of that going in, is that they need to be well, obviously prepared. They need to have strong, clear commitments to net zero. We talked about the race for zero, but if you don't have those clear commitments there, that will be something that many stakeholders will raise with you, but also be prepared for the fact that you should increasingly, people are going to look to hold you more accountable for what you say at COP28.
Thank you. Laura, could you please join us, because we have had some Dubai-specific questions that I know that you are our resident expert in Dubai. Thank you. So the first one someone's asked is, how accessible is Expo City to the rest of Dubai? Oh, Laura, I think you're on mute.
So Expo City, it's actually a brilliant venue. I don't know how many of you will have visited the Expo when it was in full swing, but it was a fabulous event, particularly as it was mid-COVID. And one thing the UAE does extremely well is execute conferences and events and manage the logistics and the movement of people safely and securely, and in a brilliant sort of the entertainment, the sort of, there'll be around all of the sort of formal engagements and events, there will also, I think, be a lot to see and do. And you can either go via the metro, which connects directly from the centre of town. So let's say the financial centre, DIFC, you could take the metro all the way. That would probably take you an hour. If you took a taxi, it would probably take you 40 minutes. So it's very accessible. What I would say is that it is slightly its own sort of microcosm. So you may find that there's lots of events, fringe events going on, like, for example, the World Action Summit, Climate Summit that Miguel referenced. That will be at the Conrad, which is the other end of town opposite the Dubai International Financial Centre. So, you might find that you don't necessarily need to stay next to Expo, because you'll find the evening events. I mean, the Expo site in the evenings, I think, will come alive. There's some fabulous spaces there, and there'll be restaurants and evening drinks and all sorts of things. And it really will be a great show. But yeah, very accessible and easy to get to. And Dubai Airport's brilliant. Abu Dhabi Airport, as I say, was an hour away. But Dubai does logistics extremely well. So in comparison to Sharm el Sheikh and Glasgow, I think that's one thing that Dubai really is going to get right.
Great, thank you very much, Laura. Miguel, one for you is, how fluid do you think the schedule could be over the next few months? I mean, is it a moving picture?
That's a good question. I think the answer to that is it's getting locked down. I mean, part of the process of the meetings that have been happening in Bonn over the last few days has been to finalize and agree the agenda itself, and then some of the key negotiating points that will happen at the COP28 meeting. I think also they've given quite a bit of time inside the agenda for COP, the outline agenda that Laura mentioned at the beginning of her remarks, and that's deliberate, and that's because they know that this is there are lots of very tough, meaty conversations that are going to have to happen with the parties on the negotiating side. So what they're doing is they're creating space for it. They've been deliberate in also saying that, thematic days that you've seen listed there, and which mirror some of the things I've been saying as being important to the presidency, they're run concurrently, so they'll be, it's not like they do a little bit about one and then move on to the next. They'll run them concurrently, and they will, they'll be looking at them through the lens of mitigation, adaptation, and finance. So they're homing in on all the things that are required. But that being said, the detail, the devil will definitely be in the detail. And what's difficult at the moment is to prejudge exactly what outcomes will emerge. It's too soon for the moment, but I think, as you head into September, we should be knowing more or less the direction of travel of what we expect to see at least being put on the table for COP, and how much progress we make. Well, that's the thing I can't guarantee. But I think they've been smart in giving plenty of space so that you can have these more, I think, difficult political conversations in the area, in the sort of the days around the COP itself.
Great, thank you very much for that. Laura, to you, we've had a question. Is it worth holding an event before COP28 officially starts? And if so, is it in Abu Dhabi or Dubai? I guess that's a question about what kind of audiences you're going to get in each city.
Yes, exactly. I think there's sort of another aspect to that as well, which is that there's going to be a lot of noise around COP, and therefore it probably does make sense to have an event in advance, because then you are not competing with all the noise. So it really depends on what your business is and who you're trying to target. If you're trying to be visible with some of the Abu Dhabi institutions like Masdar and Mubadala, etc., then you might want to focus in on something in Abu Dhabi. But if your target audience is more the business community, then it would be more likely to be Dubai.
Brilliant, thank you. Miguel, we've had one come in that says, what do you make of the 4 days being left for negotiation at the end of the meeting? How important is that? And I guess a follow-up, which is kind of a follow-up of my own, is that a time when the private sector can really, hold an event or have any sway, or is that kind of gone by then?
Well, I think when you're into the politics, it's for the member states to negotiate, so more difficult. But I would still argue that the role that the private sector can play, that's very critical, is to validate the things that people are trying to negotiate. So if we're talking about the role that the private sector capital can play in financing climate action, it'll be important to see the proof points of that being made at COP or in the run up to COP, because I think we're focused heavily on the COP itself, but there are things that you should be thinking of doing in advance of it. And I think, as Laura said, they can probably be a bit more impactful if you're doing them slightly in advance, because there'll just be things happening around the COP itself that it might be difficult to cut through. But for those people who I think September in New York's probably going to be another critical moment. There'll be a climate day that Guterres is organizing. There'll be a major focus on climate, and all the parties will be in New York for the UN General Assembly. So there'll be a sort of stepping stone to then go to the COP itself. And as I mentioned, this global stocktake will start to come out. And what's important about that is it will put people are already looking at the role that so-called non-state actors have in bridging these gaps. They'll say, well, we're not making enough progress on X, Y, and Z. Well, then the question is, what's the private sector doing? I'll give you one example. There's a report that's just been published called the Net Zero Stocktake Report, and it came out last week with the New Climate Institute, and they were looking at the private sector, and they've been tracking private sector commitments. And what they found was that if you look at all the companies that have made net zero commitments, the balance of them, the majority of them are located in Western Europe and North America. And of the other major corporations, only 37% of them come from Asia or Latin America or other regions of the world. And so Those kinds of things mean that it will be important for companies of all sectors, but also think about where companies sit around the world. You know, it'll be important for businesses to be sending these signals into that process that yes, we as businesses do care about this agenda and we're prepared to do more. So I think the proof points of when you do it, you know, you need to think about more. I can't speak specifically, but you should think about the stepping stones to COP and not just COP itself.
Brilliant, thank you, Miguel. Laura, I've had this one come in. At other COPs, there have been protests. Can we expect peaceful protests at this COP, bearing in mind it is in the UAE?
So, as I understand it, the UAE is planning a specific protest zone within Expo. And, you know, it will no doubt be carefully managed. And I think you probably have to apply to protest and, you know in advance who's coming and all the rest of it. So it will be carefully controlled, I'm sure.
Great, thank you. And Laura, there's another one for you.
Can I just say one thing? Sorry.
Oh, sorry,
Can
Miguel,
I say one
carry
thing?
on.
I forgot. I mean, I said it at the outset. This focus on inclusivity, that the specific thing I think that this COP will be quite differentiated by is youth engagement, and they're going to have at least 100 selected youth ambassadors who are going to be formally integrated into the COP negotiation process. So this is the idea that the future generations that will be most impacted by the decisions that are being made in the room are able to participate in the conversations that are happening in the room. So I think that's quite a different, that's quite different and quite new. And I think that is, you know, we talked about the demonstrators outside. I think the important thing is to understand how certain voices, you know, how people are getting their voices heard inside. And I think that's also true of Indigenous peoples, which is another place that there's a lot more emphasis on, is the voice of the Indigenous populations that have been missing from so many of these conversations in the past.
Brilliant, thank you. Laura, this is a bit of a travel agent question, but someone's asked, if you cannot stay near Expo City, where is the next best place to stay?
So it's definitely worth, if you're going to be at COP, it's definitely worth starting to plan this now, because the prices are going to skyrocket, not least because it's one of the loveliest times of year to be in the UAE. So it's peak tourism time. It's also over the first weekend is the UAE National Day. So there will be lots of people, you know, booking staycations and all the rest of it. So, you know, there are, positively though, there are hundreds of accommodation options, thousands of accommodation options in Dubai. You could consider staying in the Dubai Marina. That would take you 20 minutes to get to COP. You could stay on the Palm Jumeirah, which is, you know, coastal, and that would also take you 20 minutes by taxi to COP. Or if you know that you're going to be aligning with various business meetings at the same time, then you might want to be closer to the DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Centre, where there's also lots of hotels, Emirates Towers, you know, Ritz-Carlton, Four Seasons. There's lots of options, and to be honest, you can pretty much stay anywhere, and COP will be within 40 minutes, and that might seem like a long journey, but that's the nature of the city. It is a sort of city where you have to drive to get around. Unfortunately, it's not like London or Paris, where you might just take a quick journey on public transport.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of our webinar, so I'd just like to thank you both, and thank you everyone for attending today. We will be following up with an email, and if you do have any other further questions, please get in touch via that email. But I'd just like to thank everyone. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Laura. And we look forward to speaking to more people who attended today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.